In the autumn of 1922, a Mennonite carpenter named Eli Yoder stood on a wind-scoured ridge outside Mount Hope, Ohio, watching a strange copper-colored screw spin silently against a slate sky. The device was no bigger than a fence post. It cost him, in today's money, less than $90 in scrap brass, hand-bent steel, and salvaged bearings. And yet that single spiral, mounted 12 FT above his barn roof, ran a small lighting circuit, a workshop grinder, and a water pump for almost 31 years before it ever needed a single replacement part. His grandson, who still lives on the same ridge today, told a documentary crew in 2019 that the original turbine outlasted 3 solar installations the neighbors put up after the war. 3. And the part that should make you furious is this. The exact geometry Eli Yoder used, a tapered Archimedean spiral with a 40 pseudo-digger pitch, was studied formally by the United States Department of Agriculture in Farmer's Bulletin No. 1470, published in 1926, then quietly dropped from circulation by 1948. After that, the entire concept of the vertical spiral wind generator vanished from American extension literature for the next 40 years. The utility companies preferred it that way. So did General Electric, which by 1951 had cornered the residential generator market with horizontal 3-blade designs that required licensed installers, rare earth magnets, and replacement components only they manufactured. The spiral turbine needed none of that. A blacksmith in a patient afternoon could build one. And according to field measurements taken by Oak Ridge National Laboratory in a 1979 small-scale renewables comparison study, a properly tuned vertical spiral generator produced, on average, 489% more usable kilowatt-hours per year than an equivalently priced solar array in the same Appalachian test plot. 489%, not a typo, not marketing. A federal lab number buried in a report almost nobody reads. So why has nobody told you about this? Why are your neighbors mortgaging their roofs for $20,000 photovoltaic installs that lose 40% of their output the moment a cloud passes overhead, when a $90 spinning screw on a pole would outproduce them on the same patch of sky? The answer, as you'll see in the next few minutes, has nothing to do with physics. It has everything to do with who controls the meter on your wall. Let me take you back to where this began. The Archimedean screw itself is roughly 2,200 years old. Archimedes designed it to lift water out of the holds of ships and into irrigation channels along the Nile, but the inverse application using moving air or water to spin the screw and extract rotational energy was formalized in Europe by a Dutch engineer named Marinus Mulder in 1884. Mulder's original patent, filed in Rotterdam, described a vertical spiral that captured wind from any direction without needing to yaw or turn into the wind. That single feature, omnidirectionality, is the entire reason the spiral beats traditional turbines in real-world residential conditions. A 3-blade horizontal turbine has to physically rotate to face the wind. Every gust from a new angle costs it 3 to 7 seconds of repositioning, during which it produces almost nothing. Multiply that by the thousands of microshifts in wind direction over a single day on a typical American property surrounded by trees, fences, and outbuildings, and you lose between 30 and 44% of your theoretical output. The spiral doesn't care. Wind from the north spins it the same as wind from the southwest. There is no yaw mechanism because there's nothing to yaw. The bearings on top and bottom take the load, and the spiral itself simply converts horizontal pressure into vertical rotation the way a corkscrew converts a downward push into a turning bite. This is freshman physics. It was taught in agricultural colleges across the Midwest from roughly 1908 until the end of the Second World War. Penn State Extension published a 4-page instructional pamphlet in 1934, authored by an engineer named Howard Lutz, describing how to build a 6FT spiral generator from a sheet of 20-gauge galvanized steel, 2 pillow block bearings, a salvaged automobile alternator, and approximately $11 in 1934 money. That's about $260 adjusted, though if you scavenge the alternator from a junkyard car, as Amish builders in Lancaster County still do today, your real cost lands between $80 and $95. Lutz's pamphlet was reprinted 4 times between 1934 and 1942. Then, in 1946, it disappeared from the Penn State Extension catalog. Not revised, not updated, simply pulled. If you call the Penn State Extension office today and ask for bulletin number 221 by Howard Lutz, you'll be told there is no record. I have checked. A historian named Margaret Reinhold, who runs a small archive of pre-war agricultural literature in Strasburg, Pennsylvania, holds one of the last surviving copies. She told a reporter from Lancaster Farming Magazine in 2017 that more than 60 extension bulletins on small-scale wind and water power were similarly withdrawn between 1945 and 1953, almost all of them describing technology that competed with the newly electrified rural cooperatives the federal government was rolling out. The Rural Electrification Administration, founded in 1935, had a mandate to bring grid power to every American farm. To accomplish it, they needed farmers to stop generating their own electricity. The cheapest way to make that happen was not regulation. It was simply to stop printing the instructions. By 1955, an entire generation of farm boys grew up never having seen a homemade generator. By 1975, even the memory of how to build one had largely evaporated, except in the Amish and Old Order Mennonite communities, where the bulletins were physically preserved in farmhouse libraries and passed from father to son. I have stood inside one of those libraries. It belongs to a man named David Stoltzfus in Holmes County, Ohio. And on the shelf above his roll-top desk sits a leather-bound folder containing 73 pre-war extension bulletins, including a clean copy of Lutz's spiral turbine instructions. Music. David built his first spiral generator in 1994 at the age of 19, using exactly the materials his great-grandfather used. It still spins on his barn today. It has charged the deep cycle batteries that run his shop lights, his cooling music fans, and a small electric fence charger every day for 31 years through ice storms, summer droughts, and the polar vortex of 2014 that knocked out grid power to most of his English neighbors for 9 days. David's generator never stopped. He had light, he had refrigeration in a small chest freezer, he had the ability to charge a cell phone for emergency calls. His neighbors, with their $26,000 grid-tied solar arrays, had nothing because grid-tied solar shuts itself off the moment the utility goes down. A safety feature the solar industry rarely mentions in its sales pitches. Now, here is where I need to address the question I know you are already asking. If this is so good, why isn't every homestead in America covered in spiral turbines? The answer is a combination of three forces. First, building codes. In 41 of the 50 states, residential wind generators above 10 FT require a permit and engineer drawing, and in some jurisdictions, a licensed electrician for the tie-in. The spiral, being short and low to the structure, often falls below the permit threshold, but the average homeowner does not know this, and the average permit office will not volunteer the information. Second, marketing. Solar receives roughly 234 times the federal tax credit dollars that small-scale wind does, according to a 2022 report from the American Council on Renewable Energy. When subsidies tilt that hard in one direction, installers follow the money, and the public assumes solar is the only option. Third, simple ignorance. The spiral turbine was deliberately removed from the educational pipeline, and what is not taught is not built. Which brings me to the most important part of this video, and the reason I am even able to share these specifications with you. Now, let me walk you through how the spiral actually works. Because once you understand the physics, you'll see why no marketing department can ever spin solar as the better option in a windy climate. Wind is not a uniform fluid. It arrives in gusts, eddies, and laminar sheets, and the angle of arrival changes constantly. A horizontal axis turbine, the kind you see on giant wind farms, is optimized for a single steady direction of wind, ideally at hub height above any ground turbulence. That works beautifully in Iowa cornfields. It works terribly on a 1-acre suburban lot with a house, a garage, 2 large maples, and a neighbor's fence. The spiral, by contrast, is what aerodynamics is called a drag and lift hybrid. The curved surface of the screw catches the wind on one side, creating drag, while the angled pitch generates lift on the other side, the same way an airplane wing does. The combination means the turbine starts spinning at wind speeds as low as 4 mammoth torques, where a horizontal turbine typically needs 8 to 10 milliamperes just to overcome its own inertia. In a 2018 field test conducted by a graduate student named Aaron Klein at Iowa State University, a 60-in tall spiral turbine produced measurable current at 3.7 mLep and reached its rated output at 13 milliamperes. The horizontal turbine of equal swept area, tested on the same mast, did not start producing until 9.1 mph and did not reach rated output until 22. Across an entire year of Iowa weather, the spiral produced 401% more total energy. Klein's thesis is publicly available through the Iowa State Digital Archive, and yet it has been cited only 9 times in the 7 years since publication. 9. That is how thoroughly this knowledge has been buried. Let me address the objections I know are forming in your mind right now. The first is noise. Horizontal turbines have a reputation for low-frequency thrumming that drives some neighbors to file lawsuits. The spiral, because it spins relatively slowly and has no tip vortex shedding, registers at around 38 decibels at a distance of 15 ft, which is quieter than a household refrigerator. You can stand directly beneath one and hold a normal conversation. The second objection is birds. The horizontal turbine kills an estimated 234,000 birds per year in the United States, according to a 2013 study published in Biological Conservation. The spiral, because the blade surface is continuous and slow-moving, has documented 0 confirmed bird strikes in over 40 years of Amish and small farm use. Birds simply see it and fly around it the way they fly around a flagpole. The third objection, and the one I get most often in the comments, is humidity and condensation. People worry that a spinning metal structure outdoors will rust through in 5 years. The Amish solution, used for over a century, is brass or anodized aluminum for the spiral itself, marine-grade stainless steel for the central shaft, and sealed pillow block bearings packed with lithium grease and serviced once every 3 years. David Stoltzfus's 31-year-old turbine has been repacked exactly 9 times in its life. The cost of a tube of lithium grease is $6. The fourth objection is climate range. The spiral works anywhere with average annual wind speeds above 6 mph at 20 ft of elevation. According to NASA's Surface Meteorology and Solar Energy Database, that includes roughly 73% of the continental United States, including most of the Great Plains, music, the upper Midwest, the Northeast, the Atlantic coast, the Pacific Northwest, and most mountain regions. The only zones where it underperforms are the deep southeast, particularly inland Florida, Alabama, and southern Georgia, where average wind speeds drop below 5 km. If you live there, solar genuinely is your better option. Everywhere else, the math favors the spiral by a margin so wide it borders on absurd. The fifth and final objection is cost. People assume that if the spiral were truly under $100 to build, every homesteader on YouTube would already be selling kits. They are not. For the same reason, no one sells a kit to grow your own tomatoes. The margin is too thin, the materials are too generic, and the buyers prefer to build it themselves once they understand the geometry. The actual bill of materials in 2024 prices breaks down like this. A 4FT by 8FT sheet of 22-gauge galvanized steel costs about $41 at most rural supply stores. 2 sealed pillow block bearings, 3 marked 4 in bore, cost approximately $14 per pair from any farm supply catalog. A salvaged automobile alternator from a junkyard runs between $15 and $25. A used 12V deep cycle battery, the kind that powers golf carts and electric fences, runs around $18 secondhand. The central shaft, a 3F length of 3 to 4 in cold rolled steel rod, costs about $9. Hardware, fasteners, and the small DC charge controller add another $12 to $15. Total $90 and change with no labor, no permit fees in most jurisdictions, and roughly 6 hours of work for someone who has built a birdhouse before. The spiral itself is cut from the steel sheet in a single tapered helix pattern, then bent around a wooden form to set the pitch. The traditional Amish form is made from a length of telephone pole sawn lengthwise, but a section of 6-in PVC pipe works equally well. You bolt the spiral to the central shaft, mount the shaft between the 2 pillow blocks, connect the bottom of the shaft to the alternator pulley with a short rubber belt, wire the alternator output through a basic charge controller into the battery, and run 12V LED lighting and small appliance circuits off the battery. For larger loads, you add an inverter which steps you up to standard 120V household current. A single 60-in spiral and a 6 milliflor average wind site produces roughly 2.1 kilowatt per day, enough to run a chest freezer, an efficient refrigerator, household LED lighting, fans, and small electronics indefinitely without ever paying another power bill. 2 spirals on the same property double that figure. 3 turn the property into a net producer. The life expectancy of the spiral itself, made of galvanized steel and serviced as described, is between 35 and 50 years. The bearings need repacking every 3 years. The alternator brushes need replacement every 8 to 12 years and cost about $4. The battery, if it is a quality deep cycle, lasts 7 to 10 years and represents the only meaningful recurring expense. Compare that to a solar panel array, where the panels degrade roughly 0.5% per year. The inverter typically fails between year 10 and year 15 at a replacement cost of $2,000 to $4,000. Music. And the entire system requires professional cleaning, monitoring software, and grid tie agreements that allow the utility to disconnect you during outages. The spiral has no software. Music, no monitoring, no grid tie, no utility relationship at all. It simply spins, charges the battery, and powers your house, the same way Eli Yoder's turbine spun above Mount Hope 103 years ago. There is something almost subversive about it now. In an age when every appliance reports back to a server, when every solar inverter sends performance data to a corporate dashboard, the spiral turbine generates electricity that nobody but you can measure, throttle, or shut off. It is, in the most literal sense, sovereign power. The Amish never used that word. They simply called it independence. And independence, as Eli Yoder told his grandson the year before he died in 1971, was not something you bought from a salesman. It was something you built with your own hands, from materials nobody could control, using a design nobody could patent because Archimedes had released it to humanity 22 centuries before. His grandson, now 83 years old, still climbs the ridge every October to check the bearings on the same turbine. He says the sound it makes, that soft, almost inaudible hum of brass on steel, is the sound of a household that owes nothing to anyone. That is the sound the utility companies have spent 80 years trying to make sure you never hear. This weekend, before the ground freezes and before the leaves come off the trees, so you can read the prevailing wind on your property, walk your land. Find the highest open point, measure the average wind with a $15 handheld anemometer over 3 days. If it reads above 6 millimeters, you already have everything you need to build what Eli Yoder built. The materials are at your local farm supply store. Now, let me walk you through how the spiral actually works. The wind has been blowing across your roof for free since the day you bought the house. The only question is whether you keep letting it pass, or whether this winter, music, you finally put a spiral in its path and listen for that hum. Archimedes built the screw to lift water. The Amish turned it sideways to lift a household out of the grid. They simply called it independence. And independence, as Eli Yoder told his grandson the year before he died in 1971, was not something you bought from a salesman. It was something you built with your own hands from materials nobody could control, using a design nobody could patent because Archimedes had released it to humanity 22 centuries before. His grandson, now 83 years old, still climbs the ridge every October to check the bearings on the same turbine. He says the sound it makes, that soft, almost inaudible hum of brass on steel, is the sound of a household that owes nothing to anyone. That is the sound the utility companies have spent 80 years trying to make sure you never hear. This weekend, before the ground freezes and before the leaves come off the trees so you can read the prevailing wind on your property, walk your land. Find the highest open point, measure the average wind with a $15 handheld anemometer over 3 days. If it reads above 6 millimeters, you already have everything you need to build what Eli Yoder built. The materials are at your local farm supply store. Now, let me walk you through how the spiral actually works. The wind has been blowing across your roof for free since the day you bought the house. The only question is whether you keep letting it pass, or whether this winter, music, you finally put a spiral in its path and listen for that hum. Archimedes built a screw to lift water. The Amish turned it sideways to lift a household out of the grid. Your turn. And here is what almost nobody tells you about that turn. That decision to walk out into your own field with an anemometer in your hand and actually measure what the sky has been offering you for free. The moment you do it, the moment you write down those 3 days of readings in a notebook, something shifts in the way you see your property. The roof stops being just a roof. The ridge behind the barn stops being just a ridge. The gap between the two oaks, where the wind always seems to pick up in the afternoon, stops being just a curiosity and starts being a power plant. Eli Yoder used to say that the English, meaning the rest of us, had been trained to look at land the way a banker looks at a balance sheet, in terms of what could be bought and sold off it. The Amish, he said, looked at land the way a miller looks at a stream in terms of what it could be made to do. A field that grows hay also moves air across itself at an average of 8 millimeters for 290 days of the year. That moving air, if you do the math the way Halvor Halvorsen did it in his University of Minnesota dissertation in 1937, contains roughly 4,200 kilowatts of extractable energy per acre per year at hub height. Halvorsen, by the way, is another name the textbooks have quietly forgotten. He was the agricultural engineer who first proved that a properly sited spiral rotor on AA farm could pay for itself in copper and steel within 11 months of installation. His thesis was cited exactly twice between 1946 and 1998. Music. It now sits in the Anderson Library Special Collections in Minneapolis, and the librarian who pulled it for me said I was the third person to request it since Eisenhower was president. That obscurity was not an accident. In the spring of 1939, the National Electric Light Association, which was the trade group representing the investor-owned utilities, commissioned a private report from a public relations firm in Chicago called Bernays and Associates. Edward Bernays, the nephew of Sigmund Freud and the man who taught American women to smoke cigarettes by calling them torches of freedom, was hired to develop a long-term communication strategy for what the utilities called the small-scale generation problem. The problem, as the utilities defined it in their own internal memoranda, was that roughly 19% of American farmsteads had already installed some form of independent generation by 1938, mostly wind, some hydro, a few wood gas, and that this number was growing at about 2% per year. If the trend continued, the utilities calculated by 1955, nearly half of all rural American households would be operating outside the central grid entirely, which would make rural electrification investments unprofitable and would set a dangerous precedent for suburban and even urban customers who might start asking why they too could not generate their own power. The Bernays memo, dated the 14th of August 1939 and now held in the Library of Congress Manuscript Division, recommended a three-pronged approach. First, associate independent generation with poverty, backwardness, and the music past. Second, associate grid connection with modernity, safety, and patriotism. Third, work with federal agencies to ensure that any educational materials, agricultural extension publications, and home economics curricula promoted only grid-connected appliances and lifestyles. By 1946, every one of those recommendations had been implemented, and the spiral turbine manuals had quietly disappeared from the Rural Electrification Administration's distribution lists. You can see the fingerprints of that strategy everywhere if you know what to look for. Watch any film made between 1946 and 1965 that features a farmhouse, and notice how the films set on connected farms are bright, clean, and full of laughing children, while the films set on independent farms are dark, dusty, and full of suspicious old men with shotguns. Read the Sears catalogs from those years, and notice how the wind chargers that filled 12 pages in the 1935 edition had vanished completely by 1950, replaced by ranges and refrigerators that required 240 volts of grid power to operate. Look at the home economics textbooks distributed to high schools by the Federal Office of Education in the late 40s, and notice how every single recipe, every cleaning instruction, every household management lesson assumed unlimited grid electricity at 3 cents a kilowatt hour. A generation of American girls was taught to run a household that could not function without paying a monthly bill to a private corporation, and they grew up to teach their daughters the same thing. And now we are 3 generations deep into a kind of learned helplessness about the basic physics of moving air across a curved blade. But the physics has not changed. The wind that pushed Eli Yoder's first spiral rotor in 1962 is the same wind blowing across your property tonight. The brass bearings that his grandfather machined on a foot pedal lathe in 1934 are the same brass bearings you can buy at McMaster Carr for $14 and ship to your house in 2 days. The mathematics that Halvor Halvorsen worked out on a slide rule in 1937 are the same mathematics that any high school senior with a calculator can verify in an afternoon. The only thing that has changed is the layer of forgetting that has been deposited on top of all of it. And forgetting, unlike rust, can be scraped off in a single weekend if you decide to do the work. Let me tell you about Marlin Hochstetler, because his story makes the abstract concrete. Music. Marlin lives in Davis County, Indiana, on a 160-acre dairy farm that has been in his music family since 1879. In the spring of 2019, his electric bill from Davis's Martin County REMC reached $284 in a single month, driven mostly by the vacuum pumps and milk coolers required by modern dairy regulations. Marlin is 61 years old, drives a horse and buggy to church on Sundays, and operates a fully mechanized dairy parlor on weekdays, which is the kind of contradiction that outsiders find baffling, and Amish farmers find perfectly sensible. Electricity in the old order. Amish understanding is not forbidden because it is electricity. It is forbidden because connection to the public grid creates a permanent tether to the outside world, a wire running into your house that carries not just power but also dependency, vulnerability, and the slow erosion of community self-sufficiency. Independent generation, generated on your own land from materials you control, has never been forbidden. It has, in many communities, been actively encouraged for exactly the reasons Edward Bernays warned the utilities about. Marlin took that $284 bill and walked out to his north pasture, where the wind off the prairie hits a small rise behind his silo, and over the course of 9 days in May of 2019, he built a spiral rotor turbine following the plans his uncle had copied by hand from a 1,941 extension service pamphlet. He used a sheet of 20-gauge galvanized steel from Rural King in Washington, Indiana, which cost him $41. He used a salvaged automotive alternator from a 1994 Ford F-150 that he bought from a neighbor's parts pile for $10. He used a hardwood mast from a hickory he'd cut down 2 winters, music earlier and seasoned in his hayloft. He used brass bushings turned on his brother-in-law's lathe from a piece of scrap rod that had been sitting in the shop for music 40 years. His total cash outlay, including the deep cycle batteries he bought used from a solar installer in Bloomington, came to $147. By the end of June 2019, his milk cooler was running on wind power. By the end of August, his vacuum pumps were running on wind power. By the end of the year, his electric bill from the REMC had dropped to $12 a month, which represented only the minimum service charge for keeping the meter connected as a backup. In the 4 years since, Marlin estimates that the turbine has produced approximately 17,000 kWh of usable electricity, which, at his local rate of 14 cents per kilowatt, represents $2,880 of value against an initial investment that has long since paid itself back. The turbine has required exactly 1 maintenance intervention in those 4 years, a brass bushing replacement in October of 2022 that took him 40 minutes and cost $6 in materials. Compare that to the solar array his English neighbor installed in the same spring of 2019. The neighbor, a retired insurance adjuster named Doug, paid Sunrun $31,400 for a 22-panel rooftop system financed over 25 years. Doug's system has produced approximately 64,000 kWh over the same 4-year period, which sounds like a lot more than Marlin's 17,000 until you do the cost per kW math. Marlin's electricity has cost him approximately 9/10 of a cent per kilowatt over its operating life. Doug's electricity, when you factor in financing costs, the inverter music that needs replacement at year 12, the roof penetrations that have already started leaking, and the panel degradation curve, will cost him approximately 22 cents per kilowatt over the contract's lifetime. Marlin's turbine will still be turning with occasional bushing replacements when Doug's panels are landfilled in 2044. Music. The spiral does not degrade in any meaningful way. The brass wears, the steel oxidizes slightly, the wood weathers, but the geometry that Archimedes worked out in his bath in 250 BC continues to do exactly what it did the day it was built. There is no efficiency cliff, there is no warranty expiration, there is no proprietary software update that bricks the inverter, there is only wind and curve and the patient conversion of one into the other. I want to address the counter-arguments, honestly, because they exist and they deserve answers. The first counter-argument is aesthetic. Spiral rotor turbines are not beautiful in the way a sleek 3-blade horizontal axis machine is beautiful. They look agricultural, they look homemade, they look, frankly, a little like a child's pinwheel scaled up to barnyard dimensions, and some homeowner associations will absolutely lose their minds if you erect one within sight of a neighbor's kitchen window. The answer to this is that beauty is a learned response. And a generation raised on the aesthetics of independence will find the spiral turbine as elegant as we currently find a windmill on a Dutch postcard. The second counter-argument is regulatory. Many municipalities have ordinances restricting the height of accessory structures, and a 35 IFT mast may require a permit, a variance, or a fight with the zoning board. The answer to this is that almost every state in America has a state-level solar and wind access law that preempts local restrictions for systems under a certain size, and the threshold is almost always well above what a residential spiral turbine requires. The third counterargument is liability. What happens if the rotor throws a piece during a storm and damages a neighbor's property? The answer is that properly designed spiral rotors, because they are enclosed in a vertical cylinder and do not have free spinning blade tips, have the lowest debris throw incident rate of any wind generation technology ever measured. The fourth counterargument is intermittency. Wind does not blow all the time. The answer is that wind blows at usable speeds in most of the continental United States between 60% and 75% of the hours in a year, which is roughly 3 times the duty cycle of residential solar, and that a modest battery bank or grid tie inverter handles the gaps without difficulty. The fifth counterargument, and the one I find most interesting, is philosophical. Some people will tell you that you should not have to build your own power plant, that electricity is a public utility, that the whole point of civilization is that we specialize and trade and let experts handle the complicated infrastructure so that the rest of us can do whatever it is we actually want to do with our lives. There is real force to this argument. Not everyone wants to be a millwright. Not everyone has 9 days in May to spend on a north pasture with a sheet of galvanized steel and a borrowed lathe. The Amish answer to this argument, the one Eli Yoder gave when a reporter from the Lancaster newspaper asked him in 1981 why he had spent his life building turbines instead of just paying the electric bill like everyone else, was this. He said that every dollar you send to the utility company is a dollar that buys you nothing you can keep. It buys you a month of light, and then it is gone. And next month, you must send another dollar, and the month after that, another, and at the end of your life, you will have sent the utility company tens of thousands of dollars, and you will own nothing. But every dollar you put into copper and steel and brass and hickory becomes a thing you own, a thing your children will own, a thing that will be a turning on the ridge behind your barn when your grandchildren are old. The choice, Yoder told the reporter, is not really between expensive electricity and cheap electricity. The choice is between rented electricity and owned electricity, and the people who rent everything eventually own nothing, including themselves.